Welcome to this lecture on the role of government in the economy. There are some fundamental questions associated with public finance and the role of government in the economy. For example, why do governments intervene in the economy? How do governments intervene in the economy? And what are the effects of government intervention? We are going to cover those questions in this lecture. And we will see, for example, that some of the reasons the government intervenes in the economy is associated, for example, with market failures. What we are going to see in this lecture is that implicitly we are making a difference between what is called positive versus normative economics. Positive economics is an objective analysis of economic outcomes. For example, what is the effect of an increasing interest rate on the number of mortgage applications? You can test this assumption empirically and you would find a result. There is also what are called normative economics, which actually includes value judgments of what should be done. For example, if there are various policies to increase education spending in order to make society better off, and you have to choose between the various policies, then value judgments are going to play an important role. Of course, we have to use positive economics, data, scientific information, to inform normative economics. Now, let us have a look at the theoretical basis for government intervention. Before we do this, we need to talk about what is called the basic theorem of welfare economics. What it says is that if households and firms are perfectly competitive, taking prices as given, there is a full set of markets, and there is perfect information, then a competitive equilibrium is sufficient. Basically, what it means is that if we have a market economy that is perfectly competitive, then the outcome of this market economy is going to be efficient. Now, there are implications of this first welfare theorem that basically says that the achievement of Pareto efficiency, and what we mean by Pareto efficiency, we are going to talk about this later, that the achievement of Pareto efficiency in a competitive and private market, that we can achieve this by exhausting all gains from trade. The competitive market always serves, or very often serves, as a benchmark to actually judge actual market outcome. And here, this is the very important aspect of the first welfare theorem, that it requires the absence of market imperfections such as public goods, externalities, imperfect competition, and asymmetric information. What we are going to see in this lecture is that basically every market has one of those imperfections. The basic welfare theorem is then basically just a theoretical concept that in reality doesn't really exist. Now here, and I will point this out at multiple times throughout the lecture, we are talking about public goods, and in this case, public refers to a characteristic of the good and not the provider. So it doesn't mean that a public good is provided by the government. And we will see in great detail of what exactly it means to be a public good. The theoretical economic concepts in this lecture will be held to a minimum. However, I feel that given the topics discussed in this lecture, there are still some aspects that I would like to use graphs for. Let's start simple and look at demand and supply. When economists think about demand and supply, usually we think about a graph where we have the price of a good on the vertical axis and the quantity of a good on the horizontal axis. So you can think about this, for example, as the market for apples. Then the demand is usually downward sloping, in the sense that if the price for apples is high, then the quantity demanded for the good is low, and if the price of apples is low, then the quantity demanded is high. Now, when we have So here we have the demand function, but then of course we also have the supply function. Suppose it looks like this. And what it means is that if the price of a good is high, then firms have the incentive to produce more, and hence the quantity is higher. Now, of course, given that we have a supply and demand, we do have a quantity and a price where both are equal. So here we have, at this point here, we have the equilibrium where the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied. And we also have a market equilibrium price, which we call P star. Hence, when supply equals demand, we have an equilibrium with P star and Q star. I would like to illustrate the concept of the first welfare theorem as well as perfect competition with this graph. So on the left-hand side, we have the market, and we have the supply of a particular good, and we have the demand of a particular good. And where supply and demand intersect, we have an equilibrium market price, and we also have a quantity Q star. And here I have marked this with an M for market. Now, on the left-hand side, this is the market situation, whereas on the right-hand side, you have a particular firm that is active in the market. Note that there are many firms like this in the market. Since we are talking about perfect competition, we do have many consumers as well as many firms or many producers. Usually how we illustrate this is that we have on the firm side, we have what is called the marginal cost. So the marginal cost is the cost it takes to produce an additional unit of the good. Okay, and we have the average total cost, in the sense that how much on average does it cost to produce the good. Now, in a perfectly competitive market, the firms set the market price that is prevailing in the market. And remember that we are talking about price-taking behavior, in the sense that the firm knows that the market price cannot be changed by individual action. The firm takes the market price as given, and they set marginal cost equal to the price. Okay? So think about if the price was higher than the marginal cost. So think about, for example, that this is the market of, let's say, wooden chairs or chairs. Okay. Then if the price that they could receive for an additional chair, or if they sell an additional chair, they would receive the price. If the additional cost is lower than the price, then they would produce that chair. The same is true if the additional cost or the marginal cost was higher than the price, they would not produce the chair, and hence the equilibrium is where this price is equal to the marginal cost. And for perfect competition, we also have the situation that the gains or the profits are exhausted, in the sense that you have more and more, since you have free entry and exit, firms are entering the market as long as there's a profitable condition. Now, suppose that for some reason you have a shift in the demand. In the sense that you have an increase in the demand. Then what you can see is that in the short run, you would have an increase in the price. And the firm would again set the price, let's call this P double star, would set the price equal to their marginal cost. Let's call this QF double star. Okay, and that now, since the price is higher than the cost of production, we can think about this as a per unit profit. If there is a per unit profit, then firms are actually going to see this profit and are going to enter the market, and hence we would see a shift in the supply because now firms are entering. Let's call this the new supply, and the price would go back down to the initial equilibrium, okay, where all the profits are exhausted. So if people think about the perfect competition or the first welfare theorem, or if economists think about the first welfare theorem and perfect competition, then this is what they have in mind, in the sense that given the condition of free entry and exit, here you have a profit condition in the industry, and hence you have an expansion of the supply because firms can easily enter into the market, and this actually drives down the profits for each individual firm. So this is what we think about the efficiency of a perfectly competitive market. Now let us have a look at the reasons for government intervention. As said before, market imperfections exist, and this leads to an actual inefficient allocation of societal resources. For example, if we have public goods, then those goods are actually underproduced. They are not produced at the efficient or optimal level for society. When we have externalities, then we are facing an over or underproduction of the good, depending on whether it is a positive or a negative externality. Also, when we have imperfect competition means here we have a firm that has a monopoly, then we are having an underproduction of goods. The basic welfare theorem requires that a perfectly competitive market exists, and what a perfectly competitive market is that you have many producers and many consumers, you have free entry and exit into the market, you have price-taking behavior, and you have perfect information. Let me give you an example of such a market. If you're thinking about ride-sharing apps like Uber or Lyft, then you can think about that you have many producers, that is many drivers, you have many consumers, that is many people that would like to have a ride. You also have relatively free entry and exit into the market, in the sense that all that you need to be a consumer is you need to have a smartphone and the app, and all you need to be a producer is that you have a car and the app as well. We will see that price-taking behavior is a little bit more complicated. So price-taking behavior, what it means is that individual market participants, producers and consumers, know that they have no influence on the price. Okay? So here with the ride-sharing app, that's a little bit more complicated, as said, because you actually have the price that is set by a particular company. But think about the individual drivers and as well as the individual people wanting wanting a ride, that they take the price as given, knowing that they have no influence on that price. Now, besides correcting for market failures, there are also other reasons why governments would intervene. One extremely important reason is economic stabilization, basically ensuring economic growth and preventing high unemployment and preventing high inflation. You have seen this multiple times over the last decades. If you're thinking about the 2008 financial crisis or also the COVID-19 pandemic, where governments have intervened globally as well as in the US significantly to basically prevent a meltdown of the economy. There is also the aspect of redistribution, in the sense that you have transfer payments from one entity to the other, for example, from firms to individuals or between individuals, to ensure a minimum standard of living for all members of society. Okay. Now here, note that this is one aspect where, for example, normative economics comes into play, in the sense of how much transfer payments should there be. Now, to illustrate that the answer to that is actually not clear, is I have taken here a question from the General Social Survey of 2022. The General Social Survey, for those who do not know what it is, it's basically an annual survey that is measuring social trends in the United States. And here, this particular question is the following. We are faced with many problems in this country, none of which can be easily solved or inexpensively. I'm going to name some of those problems, and for each one I'd like you to name some of those problems, and for each one I'd like you to tell me whether you think we are spending too much money on it, too little money, or about the right amount. Here, for this particular question, it was about welfare spending. Basically, are we spending too much or too little or about the right amount on welfare? And you see that the responses are basically 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, where people say too little, about right, and too much. So what this means is that at least the welfare payments, usually a minimum amount of welfare payment is okay, but then the question is of how much to spend is more difficult to answer. I mentioned before about the economic stabilization role of government, meaning that we have low and stable inflation rate. You have seen this over the last 2 years, that governments and especially central banks have put considerable effort in fighting high inflation. There's also the low unemployment rate, which is also a goal of every government. Note that the inflation rate is usually in the room of monetary policy conducted by an independent central bank, for example, by setting the interest rate, but that the government is responsible for fiscal policy, for example, for tax expenditures, tax policies, etc. With fiscal policy, there's also the issue of time lag between implementation and actually the policy effects taking place. As mentioned before, the role of governments is also about redistribution, that because the income usually goes to people that own some valuable resource in a market economy. And those resources, that could be property, that could be particular skills, that could be land, is unequally distributed among people. There's usually the motivation for redistribution as a social conscience and also a fear of social disorder. Governments can implement policies in order to redistribute wealth from one entity to the other, for example, by transfer payments or what are called progressive taxes. Progressive taxes, and we will talk about this in this lecture, basically that people with a higher income are going to pay a higher percentage in taxes. Now, the question is, how do governments actually intervene in the economy? There are various ways governments can intervene in the economy, for example, by the production of goods and services. You can think about infrastructure investment, but then you also have to think that the government production of goods and services also requires taxes for those projects or goods and service provision to be funded. Governments can also influence private production, for example, by regulating or subsidizing production. Government can also purchase the goods and services from the private sector. And then, of course, there's going to be fiscal policy that can, for example, redistribute income through transfer payments. But then there are also taxes on income and corporate profits. Now, let us talk a little bit about the provision and the production of services, of goods and services. If you think about the goods and services that you are receiving, there are basically three sources of those services. It can either come from private production, from public production, or from non-profits. The question is, well, who will provide what services and what goods? Some goods and services may benefit bigger than the cost of production, but for some reason they're not produced, or they will not be provided by the private market. And we will talk about this concept when we talk about public goods. Then also, the question is, once you know that a particular good or service should be produced, then the question is, should there be a public or should it be a private production? Now let us look at some examples. First, we are going to look at public provision and public production. So if you're thinking about local school districts, state police departments, federal emergency management, Bureau of Motor Vehicles, etc., then you have here the public provision in the sense that the public is responsible for providing as well as for producing the goods. You also have private provision and public production of goods. So for example, if you're thinking about the police control at rock concerts, if you have commercial satellite launched by the NASA, then you have private provision and public production. Sometimes you also have public provision and private production. So think about private prisons, charter and voucher schools, private military contractors, and basically almost every weapon system. If you're thinking about the public provision, they're using those, for example, those prisons or those private military contractors, but they are actually privatized. They're coming from a private production. And then, of course, you also have the private provision and private production that basically think about here. We have private schools, Indiana toll roads, etc. Okay, and most goods that you are actually purchasing. Now, the question is, what are the economic effects of government intervention? We will see that, for example, government intervention can actually re-establish market efficiency to correct for market failures. An example here would be, for example, a Pigouvian tax or a monopoly regulation. A Pigouvian tax, for example, is if you have a negative externality or a product that causes damage to society, then if you are taxing this good, the efficiency can be re-established. If you have a monopoly, then you can regulate the monopoly, for example, by setting a price ceiling in order to restore efficiency. We are going to talk about efficiency a lot, but we also have to take into account equity. That efficiency very often is not the only goal, but that equity is a goal as well, in the sense that you have to protect certain groups, for example, low-income groups, and the protection of those groups may actually outweigh the efficiency considerations from a political perspective. When we are talking about the economic effects of government intervention, we also have to think about the interactions between policies. For example, you have a federal subsidy on electric vehicles. That is a subsidy, a benefit for electric vehicle owners. But then you also have states that are imposing a registration fee on electric vehicles. And there you have interaction between a subsidy on one side, or a subsidy at the federal level, and a tax at the state level. Now, let us talk about some market failures, specifically public goods, externalities, and imperfect competition, and show why government should intervene and how efficiency can be restored. So a public good is a characteristic and does not refer to the provider of the good. You can categorize goods along two dimensions. You can as rivalry and excludability. So let us first start with rival and excludable good. Rival in consumption means that if you are consuming a particular good, that your consumption affects the consumption of somebody else. Excludability means that you can exclude people from consuming the good. So if you're thinking about private goods, if you're thinking about a sandwich, for example, then if you are consuming the sandwich, then nobody else can consume the sandwich, and you can also exclude people from eating the sandwich. We also then have club goods, in a sense that you can exclude people from consuming the good. But once people are within a club, if you will, the consumption is non-rival. You can think about, for example, a golf club or a swim club. That once you are in the swimming pool, that you can exclude people from getting into the swimming pool, but your consumption of the water in the swimming pool does not affect the consumption of others. Then, where it gets more difficult from a policy perspective, are common goods and public goods. So common goods is where you cannot exclude people from using the good, but consumption is rival. The prime example here are grazing lands, or public grazing lands. You can put your cattle or your livestock on the grazing land. Nobody can prevent this, but what your livestock eats or what your cattle eats, somebody else's cattle cannot eat. So here we have a rival consumption. A public good, and this is what I mean by characteristic, is non-rival and non-excludable in consumption, in the sense that you cannot exclude people from using the good, and also the consumption is non-rival, in the sense it doesn't matter how many people use the good, you cannot exclude them. The consumption does not affect others. So here, think about me installing a street light in front of my house. Then it's not provided by the government because it is a private investment, that street light, but I cannot exclude people from using the street light, and it doesn't matter how many people are using the street light, the consumption is non-rival. So here are a couple of examples of those various categories. Private goods, we have seen that this could be sandwich, laptops, etc., clothing. Then club goods, they're also known as toll goods. They're usually underproduced. You can think about those as movies in theaters, toll roads, concerts, etc. Common goods, you have the fishing grounds, you have petroleum reserves besides the grazing land, which I have used before, and you have also aquifers. Okay, and then public goods. The prime example for public goods is national defense. So basically, if you're living within the United States or any other country, then you're benefiting from national defense. And it doesn't matter of how many people actually live within the country. They all, the consumption of national defense is non-rival. Other examples here are mosquito abatements, pollution control, disease control, lighthouses, or the global positioning system. Note that the additional cost of providing a public good to more people is basically zero. Now, in the lecture, I have claimed that public goods are underprovided. Now, let us have a look at some economic concepts of why that is the case. Think about you have three residents, resident A, B, and resident C, and that they are receiving a particular benefit from a good that is provided. Let's call Q means the quantity, which is on the horizontal axis, the units of the good provided. And then think about the marginal benefit or the additional benefits they get on the horizontal axis. Now, the key characteristic of a public good is that the consumption is not rival, in the sense that if 1 unit of the good is provided, then resident A, B, and C are benefiting from that 1 unit. Note that this is fundamentally different from compared to a private good, where if 1 unit is provided, that single unit is going to either A, B, or C, but not all three. Hence, that is the reason why we have a public good, that everybody benefits from the provision of 1 unit of that good. So we have the three residents, and if we are looking at the, if we are aggregating this, and this is in the graph below. So here we have again the quantity and then the total marginal benefit. Then think about if we are not providing the good at all, then the marginal benefit is 2 for resident A and 5 for resident B and C. And since the consumption is non-rival, that means that the marginal benefit starts at 12. So 5 plus 5 plus 2. And then if you're looking at the first unit provided, okay, then there is a marginal benefit for all 3 residents from that single unit which is provided in the market. Okay, so from that single unit everybody benefits. So you have somewhere the marginal benefit from the first unit is up here, and you can do this for all the units. And note that after 3 units, it is only resident C who is getting the additional benefit. So the societal marginal benefit would go all the way up to 3, okay, because we only now have resident C. But then if we are going below C, it's also the resident A and resident B who are receiving the benefits. And so the total benefit of providing this public good looks like this, the red line. Okay, so this is the total marginal benefit. Or think about the societal benefit. Now, here is the problem why the good may be underprovided. Consider that the cost or the marginal cost of this product to be very high. Okay, so if we have the total marginal benefit and we have the marginal cost, then the efficient societal quantity would be, say, 2 units. Okay, so that would be the efficient quantity to be provided from a societal perspective. However, since the marginal cost is so high, if it is left to the individual residents, resident A, B, and C, the good would not be provided at all. Okay, so hence, despite the fact that it would be beneficial to society to provide the good, where all residents would benefit, the cost is so high that the good would not be provided. And hence here we have the situation why a public good is underproduced, or in this case the public good would not be produced at all. Now, the second category that we are going to look at, or the second source of market failure, are what are called externalities. There can be positive externalities and there can be negative externalities. Positive externality is basically if you are producing, or if your action is producing a benefit to somebody else and you are not getting compensated for this benefit. So think about, for example, landscaping. When I have, for example, I have a house, I pay attention to the landscaping, and that my neighbor wants to sell their house. Now, if I pay attention to my landscaping and somebody looks at the house of my neighbor to purchase it, and they see that I'm paying attention to landscaping, or I have a nice landscape, then it may be easier for my neighbor to sell the house. So there, my action of landscaping is having a positive benefit to my neighbor, and I do not get rewarded for that. Also beekeeping, that is for pollination and agriculture, university research and development. If you're thinking about the university, any state, any university, that they are providing positive benefits to the community. Of course, when you have positive externalities, you can also have negative externalities, and that is when action or the production of a good is resulting in uncompensated cost borne by others. Here, the example would be, would be cigarette smoke. If you are going into a bar, and suppose in that bar people are still allowed to smoke, and you are a non-smoker, then the consumption of cigarettes is imposing an externality, is imposing a cost on you in terms of health, in terms of smell of your clothing, for example. You can also think about the Gulf of Mexico hypoxic zone. Basically, what hypoxic means is lack of oxygen. And that is, in the Gulf of Mexico, it is a zone that is caused by farmers in the Midwest putting fertilizer on their fields. Then rain comes, washes it into the Mississippi River. The fertilizer drains down into the Gulf of Mexico, and fertilizer in the Gulf of Mexico is doing what it's supposed to do. It is growing plants, specifically algae. And those algae, they are depriving the ocean of oxygen, and basically no fish can live within that so-called dead zone. If you're fishing in the Gulf of Mexico and you cannot go into that particular zone because there are no fish, then you have this negative externality imposed on people being in fisheries in the Gulf of Mexico. An additional example is also the history of firefighting. Before firefighting was publicly organized, there were so-called fire insurance marks, in the sense that if you wanted, back in the days, if you wanted your house to be protected for fire, or you wanted firefighters to actually come to your house, you needed an insurance mark. So basically what it was a plaque over that was attached to your house of a particular company, and only the fire department only went to houses that actually had fire insurance with a particular company. So of course, if you do not have fire insurance, if you have fire insurance but your neighbor doesn't, and the house of your neighbor burns down and the fire department doesn't come, then that is imposing an externality on you. Note that, to be specific, fire protection is a public good, but firefighting is not. Okay, so once your house is on fire and you have the fire department at your house, then that is not a public good anymore because they are occupied with your house. This is just on a side note that if the externalities, or if the action of market participants have an effect on the market price, then this is a pecuniary externality, and it is not really an externality in the economic sense, because we have no market. We do not have a market inefficiency. We only have a market effect. Let us talk about negative externalities. Here again, you have the graph which we have seen before in this lecture, where you have the demand function, you have the price on the vertical axis, and the quantity on the horizontal axis. Previously, we have called this the supply function, which it still is, but we can actually show that this is equal to what is called the marginal cost function of the firm. Right. Marginal cost means the additional cost it requires to produce one more unit. Now, when you're talking about externalities, it turns out that this marginal cost function, this is the private marginal cost function. Okay, this is the marginal cost observed by the firm. Again, as before, we would have an equilibrium with a quantity Q star and a price P star. Now, suppose that this good is actually causing a negative externality. Remember that an externality or negative externality is a cost that is borne by non-market participants. So if you're thinking about cigarettes, for example, you have the demand for cigarettes, you have the supply of cigarettes, there's an equilibrium price and a quantity, but for each unit consumed of the cigarette, there is not only the cost of producing that cigarette, but there is a cost in terms of healthcare that is borne or that is shifted to society. So you not only have a private marginal cost, but you also have a so-called social marginal cost. Which means that for each quantity consumed, there is an additional cost that is onto society. So you can see that for the quantity Q star, that we have this additional cost here. Okay. And it can be shown that, and this would be for a much more extensive video, it can be shown that if you have a negative externality, that this triangle here is what is called as a deadweight loss. Think about this as an inefficiency. Okay. And it can be shown that society would be better off, or to avoid this inefficiency, if society were to produce at, let's call this Q prime, and at a higher price P prime. In the slides, I mentioned that if we have a negative externality and we have this inefficiency, that government could actually restore efficiency in the sense that the government could implement a policy to shift consumption of the good, or the consumption and production of the good, from here to here. And it turns out that in order to make market participants internalize this social marginal cost, the government could impose what is called a Pigouvian tax. And the Pigouvian tax would be in the amount of the externality. Okay, so here we could have a Pigouvian tax. And if the government were to implement this Pigouvian tax, then the marginal cost, or the private marginal cost plus the tax, could be made equivalent to the social marginal cost. And hence, we would be having this new equilibrium that is efficient at P star, at P prime and Q prime. Okay, so this is what we mean, that good with negative externality is overproduced, in the sense that in the absence of regulation or in the absence of any policy, the good would be produced at Q star, but in reality you want the good to be produced at Q prime. Now, the next market inefficiency that warrants attention by the government is imperfect competition. I mentioned before that the first welfare theorem requires that we have many producers and many consumers. We have free entry and exit, we have price-taking behavior, and we also have perfect information. However, if those characteristics are not satisfied, then we can have a market failure. And here, the particular one that we are interested in is what is called imperfect competition. So imperfect competition is usually when you have, in many cases, if you only have one or very few producers and you have many consumers. then you are not in the setting anymore where you have price-taking behavior, in the sense that particular firms or a group of firms can actually set the price. So we have price-setting behavior. That is usually, if we have one firm, we have a monopoly. If we have just a handful of firms, we have an oligopoly. Okay. A monopsony and an oligopsony is the reverse situation, when we have when the market power is actually not in the hand of the producer, but if the market power is in the hand of the consumer. So if you have just one or a handful of consumers. Here you can think about, for example, a large grocery store in a rural area, and if it's the only grocery store and it is actually getting, say, local products, then you have a monopsony, because you have that grocery store that is alone in an area, and you have all the say farmers supplying to that grocery store. And this is actually also imperfect competition does result in efficiency loss. Now, there are other market failures that I want to touch on. So we have asymmetric information as well as adverse selection. So basically, adverse selection is a situation where market participants are affected by asymmetric information. Asymmetric information means that one party of a trade does not have full information. You can think about this. The prime example here is used cars. Usually the seller of the used car has much more information about the reliability of the car than the buyer. You can also think, if you're purchasing health insurance, if you're purchasing car insurance, then usually you have more information about your driving record or your driving ability than the insurance company has. Also, you have about, when you're thinking about employment, then you have a transaction usually that a company is hiring you, then you have more information about that ability than the company hiring you. That's the reason why you sometimes have assessment centers, or why you have to go to a job interview, because the company wants to reduce that asymmetric information. One of the solutions would be to reduce asymmetric information is, for example, to identify market subgroups and then price differently. So for example, if an insurance company can actually identify the good drivers and the bad drivers, then the insurance company can charge different prices according to the risk profile of the drivers. You also have moral hazard. So that basically means if you change your risk engagement to the presence of insurance. You think about property insurance. The US government is providing flood insurance at a significantly discounted rate. So for example, here I mentioned that the premium for federal flood insurance is about 38% of what it should be in the free market. So if you did not have federal flood insurance, then people would probably be unable to purchase homes in a flood zone, in the sense that the insurance would be much higher than the insurance premium would be much higher than it should be. Okay. Now, we have talked a lot about efficiency in this lecture, so let's dive a little bit more into efficiency, and we are going to cover more aspects throughout this entire lecture. There are basically two efficiency criteria that I would like to talk about, and this is what is called, the first one is called Pareto efficiency, and the second one is called Kaldor-Hicks efficiency. The Pareto criterion for a policy means that you implement a policy if at least one person is better off, with no other person being worse off. Note that this is extremely restrictive, because you have to ensure that no other person is worse off. The Kaldor-Hicks criterion is a little bit more general, in the sense that if you have positive net benefits to society, such that the winners, at least in theory, could compensate the losers, then the policy is efficient. Okay, and you have the Kaldor-Hicks criterion is usually the basis for cost-benefit analysis. The drawback of the Kaldor-Hicks criterion of efficiency is that the improvement is only potential and may not be realized. Now let us have a look at an example. Okay, so think about you have 5 residents, A, B, C, D, and E, and that there's a particular there's a particular project that should be implemented. And that project costs $10,000. And the costs are shared equally among the 5, would be shared equally among the 5 residents at $2,000 each. Now, think about that. You have here the individual benefits of this project to the resident A, B, C, D, and E. And you see that the benefits, if you add up the benefits, that the benefits are bigger than the cost. So here, this project actually meets the Kaldor-Hicks criterion because the winners could compensate the losers. But when you look at the individual gains, so the individual gain for the first person would be the 3,500 minus the 2,000, that you only have 2 people having an individual gain and 3 people having a loss. So this project would not meet the Pareto criterion. And also, if you actually were to put this project to a vote, it would fail at 3-2. Okay.